In many recollections of the Normandy campaign, people tend to speak of firepower, of morale, of the decisions made by commanders on both sides, yet few are willing to mention the factor that decided the outcome at the lowest level of the fighting: hunger. In June 1944, when the Allies drove toward the northern coast of France with landing craft, destroyers, tanks, and an unchallenged command of the air, the German soldiers at the front had already lost another invisible war, the war against hunger. Among oak woods, wheat fields, and village roads blasted into craters, countless German soldiers inscribed the footnote of this defeat with exhaustion, weakness, and eyes that had become hollow. The war was not decided in the roar of guns, but in the emptiness of hungry stomachs. Erich Schmidt was one of those soldiers, a communications man with nothing more than the rank of corporal. He had been born in a small town in Hesse, and from his youth onward he had been taught that the strength of the nation will never be exhausted, that the enemy is on the brink of collapse, that German industry will crush any challenger. These phrases recurred in classrooms, in radio broadcasts, on posters pasted to the walls, omnipresent like the air. Only when he reached the front in Normandy, only when he cupped a piece of black bread that had turned dark and tried to scrape the green mold from its surface, did those long-held beliefs show their first, faint cracks. In the first week after the Normandy landings, the communications team to which Erich belonged hardly ate anything that could truly be called food. The supply lines were repeatedly smashed by Allied aircraft, and the rations sent from the rear were either pulverized by bombing or left behind in burning trucks to turn into charred debris. All that the German soldiers at the front could rely on were damp black bread, spoiled canned goods, and so-called emergency rations. Hard blocks mixed with flour substitutes, chaff, and even tiny splinters of wood. Eating such things did little to restore their strength and left their throats feeling scraped and raw. Some soldiers would soak the blocks in muddy water to soften them a little, then laboriously crush them between their teeth. Erich tried it once. He squatted at the corner of a farmhouse wall that had been half blown down and dipped the block of ration, hard enough to strike sparks, into a puddle where rainwater and mud had mixed. Grey specks of dust floated on the surface, tainted with a faint smell of rotting meat, but it was his only choice. He scooped up the softened mass and swallowed it. His stomach clenched and spasmed as if a twisted fist had seized it from within. He coughed, gagged, his eyes filling with tears, yet he forced himself to bite again and again. Hunger strips away pickiness, and it strips away dignity. Faith can help a man endure hunger, but it cannot make his food fresh. The German troops at the front were not crushed by the enemy's firepower. They were felled by the mold and sour rot in their own warehouses. Cans, poorly stored, swelled and bulged, and when opened, released acrid gas. Black bread soaked up moisture during transport, its surface blooming with greenish mold. Soldiers could only scrape off the outer layer with their knives and silently pray their bodies could withstand what remained. Many of them suffered diarrhea, vomiting and fever, their strength draining away with alarming speed. Entire companies, dozens of men, squatted or slumped beside drainage ditches, clutching their stomachs and groaning. They looked more like a unit afflicted by plague than a regular formation preparing to face the Allied forces. During that time, Erich felt with painful clarity that his body was deteriorating at frightening speed. When he carried out communications duties, his hands shook beyond his control, and the hum of static in his headset tormented him more than any report of enemy movement. He had once believed he could hold out on the front for several months, but hunger compressed his endurance into a matter of days, then hours, and finally into brief struggles measured only by whether he could force down the next mouthful. He began to understand a cruel truth. Supply was not the backdrop to war. It was the precondition that decided whether the war could continue at all. By the end of June, a sudden Allied assault left Erich's small group encircled. They went 3 days without eating anything that could be called real food, and on the last day they could not even get a share of moldy rations. Several older soldiers collapsed from dehydration by the roadside, their lips cracked chalk white and brittle as if they would crumble at a touch. Erich walked at the rear of the line, the communications set on his back. His vision darkened and blurred again and again, while the roar of explosions and the rush of the wind merged into a single haze in his ears. His goal was no longer complete the mission, but simply stay alive long enough to reach the next stand of trees. On the evening of the third day, American soldiers advanced from the far side of the woods. For the first time, Erich felt a strange sense of relief. It was not surrender, but his body telling him that to go on would mean dying of his own hunger. He laid down his weapon along with the rest of his team and was marched away toward a prisoner of war assembly point in the rear. Hunger had made him put down his rifle. Hunger had also made him put down his last illusions. In the first hour of captivity, Erich moved in a fog, half dazed, half conscious. He thought what awaited him would be humiliation, rough handling, perhaps the muzzle of a gun. Instead, the American soldiers did something else. They began handing out food. Not symbolic, contemptuous scraps, but food that was whole, clean, and properly sealed. When taste begins to tell the truth, lies lose their power. Erich saw with his own eyes as a U.S. military policeman carrying a bulging canvas bag on his back casually took out a square field ration. The wrapping paper glinted pale yellow in the sunlight, its edges neat without tears, without mold, without grease stains. It did not look like something from a battlefield, but rather like an item one might find on the shelf of a quiet city supermarket. The MP tossed the ration into his arms. The weight of it, at that instant, was solid and real. His arms, weakened by hunger, almost failed to catch it, but he clutched that neutrally warm block to his chest with all his strength. Erich stared at the packaging in disbelief. There was no smell, no stench, no distortion. It had been a long time since he had seen food without a smell. In his memory, food always came with the odors of mold, sourness, rot, or rust. His hands trembling, he tore open the wrapper. The dry, crisp sound of paper against paper was like a reminder. This was real food. Inside there was a small sealed pat of butter, pale and gentle in color, not the dull, yellow substitute so common in German rations. There were a few moderately hard, salty crackers with smooth surfaces and no discoloration. There was also a small packet of sweets, the orange wrapping paper looking almost luxurious to his eyes. In addition, there was a strip of jerky, a handful of raisins, and a piece of chewing gum. All of them part of the basic kit issued to American troops at the front. Erich froze. He did not know which item to eat first, or whether he should eat them at all. He felt a flicker of fear, afraid that all this was an illusion, a hallucination summoned by extreme hunger. Only when the prisoner beside him sat down and bit into a cracker with a clear, sharp snap did he finally accept that it was real. He raised a cracker to his mouth. In that instant his eyes filled with moisture, not because of the flavor, but because of the absence of any off-flavor. The cracker was clean, straightforward, bearing only a salty fragrance, with no trace of mold, no taste of dust, none of the bitter edge of decay. Erich suddenly realized he had forgotten what food is supposed to taste like. The enemy's cracker was more convincing than all the slogans of his homeland. He gently brushed his tongue over the butter, feeling it slowly melt in his mouth with a soft, creamy richness. He did not know whether this should be called delicious or simply the taste of being alive. He went on eating the contents of the ration, moving so slowly it was as if he were carrying out a ritual. He did not dare take big bites or eat too fast, afraid his stomach could not handle it, and just as afraid that all of this would be taken away the next second. Butter clung to his fingertips, faintly glistening. He stared blankly at that thin sheen of light, feeling that he had never seen such a clean, gentle color in any scene connected with the war. He was used to seeing rust, mud, ash, blood, all those things that obscured every bright tone in life. Yet now, a pat of butter felt as though it had fallen into his hand from another world. Suddenly, he became aware that a deeper reality was closing in on him. If the Americans could hand out such rations so casually at the front, even while escorting prisoners, what kind of stores must they have in their rear areas, in their warehouses, in their ports? If a country could so easily give high-quality food to prisoners of war, what kind of advantage did it hold in this conflict? The slogan he had heard since childhood, "The enemy is approaching exhaustion," was torn to shreds in that moment. When lies collapse, they make no sound, but they leave a taste. Erich's throat quivered slightly as he swallowed a small piece of cracker. It was no longer just a cracker, but a boundary line. A line dividing his past from his future. He suddenly remembered how an old soldier at the front had once muttered, "We're not fighting the British and Americans, we're fighting their factories and their granaries." At the time he had dismissed it as complaining and defeatism. Now he realized it had been the closest thing to the truth he had ever heard. They kept marching toward the prisoner assembly area. Along the way, American soldiers repeatedly reached into their packs, belt pouches and pockets to hand small items to the prisoners: candy, crackers, chewing gum. One even pushed a piece of apple into the hand of a young German recruit who had grown so thin he was little more than skin and bone. The young recruit stood there stunned, as if he had received a gift he could not comprehend. His lips trembled, and in the end he began to cry softly in the middle of the column. The sound was not loud, but it spread like a hairline crack along the emotions of the entire line of prisoners. Erich heard someone mutter beside him, "If they really were on the verge of collapse, how could they toss food around like this?" No one answered, but everyone heard it. The silence itself was the answer. When the column reached a bend in the road, Erich saw an American supply truck parked at the roadside, its canvas cover lifted on one side. Inside were crates, and in the crates stacked cans of rations, one after another. The cans were neat, dry, unmarked by rust, each one looking as if it had just come off the factory line. An American soldier sat on the edge of the truck, absent-mindedly chewing on a chocolate bar. Crumbs of chocolate fell to the ground and were casually ground underfoot by his boot. He was not trying to show off. He simply treated food as something too ordinary to merit attention. The extravagance of material supply revealed itself most completely in such unintentional gestures. For a moment, Erich's steps faltered. He had never seen a war carried on with such ease, such nonchalance, such complete lack of want. Those cans, gleaming with metallic sheen, seemed to mock every belief he had held. The enemy's warehouse had never weighed on him as heavily as it did now. He suddenly grasped another layer of truth. When a country's soldiers are stumbling half-blind with hunger on the battlefield, while their enemy's prisoners are being stuffed with clean food on the march, the outcome of the war is almost already written. When the column finally reached the prisoner assembly point, the Americans followed their procedures and divided them into different groups for registration, numbering and physical examination. The medic frowned when he examined Erich. His weight was a full 16 pounds below the standard, the muscles of his arms badly atrophied, and even a light press on his abdomen elicited a pain response. The medic's face did not change. He merely said flatly, "Malnutrition." Erich almost felt like laughing, because it was the first time in months that anyone had described his condition accurately. When they were led into the makeshift camp area, the setting sun shone in from the direction of the wire, stretching the shadows of the camp long across the ground. The wire, the wooden posts, the guard towers, these structures looked hard and unforgiving, yet none of them were as frightening as hunger. Inwardly, Erich felt a strange sensation rising. He no longer needed to worry about what he would eat tomorrow. It was not freedom, but it was a kind of reassurance. They were told to sit on a patch of open ground. American soldiers pushed over a metal drum filled with hot water. Steam slowly rose into the air, carrying the mixed smell of iron and heated water. One soldier scooped several spoonfuls of coffee powder into the drum and stirred. At once, the rising steam carried the bitter aroma of coffee. The scent drifted out gently, curling through the entire camp. The moment Erich caught the smell, it was as if something struck his mind. He had never imagined that a camp for prisoners of war could have coffee, and not for the guards, but for the prisoners. He stared at the steam wreathing the drum, his gaze unfocused. He remembered that the last liquid he had drunk at the front had been rainwater flecked with mud. He remembered slicing moldy bread into thin pieces and toasting it until it was nearly charred, just to drive off the stench. He remembered how hunger had kept him from sleeping at night and from concentrating during the day. The smell of coffee brought with it a warmth so absurd that it unsettled him. "Line up," an American soldier said. They obeyed, moving forward like machines. Cups of coffee were handed out one by one, the simplest of drinks, and yet it subtly transformed the expressions on the prisoners' faces. Some stared at their cups in a daze. Some cradled the metal like a treasure in both hands. Some brought the rim to their noses, trembling slightly as they inhaled the scent. Suddenly Erich felt as though he had been defeated, not physically, not by the enemy's guns, but by a collapse that spread jointly from his stomach to his mind. In the propaganda, America was a land of shortages, of imminent breakdown, clinging on with its last reserves of strength. In reality, America was handing out fruit cans to prisoners, pushing cigarettes into their hands and setting coffee before them. The enemy's candy had more power than the slogans of his homeland. An American soldier came over to Erich, picked up a piece of chocolate and tossed it lightly into his arms. "Here, for later." The tone was so relaxed it bordered on casual. Erich froze. The chocolate in his hands was wrapped in paper snugly and tightly, the genuine product of a factory line, not the occasional fragment scavenged at the German front, usually in crumbs or already separated into sugar and fat. He gave the wrapper a gentle squeeze, and the feeling beneath his fingers loosened something that had been wedged deep inside him. At last he understood. Germany's defeat had not been caused by a single battle. It had been written from the day the food began to run short. The prisoners ate in near silence. The quiet itself was a kind of collapse, because every one of them was using the same fact to break the same belief. They had been deceived, and the price of that deception was to be crushed now in utter stillness by reality. The soldiers began ladling out hot soup. It was made from canned soup stock, the simplest and most ordinary of broths, yet in the eyes of the prisoners it might as well have been holy water in a chapel. The rich aroma rose along with the steam, drifting through the air and across one hungry face after another, silently overturning the world each of them had carried inside. When Erich picked up his own bowl, his hands were astonishingly steady. Perhaps it was because he had gone so long without holding anything warm. Or perhaps it was because he knew this bowl of soup represented more than food. It represented the existence of another world. He took the first sip. The savory taste flooded his tongue, and he shut his eyes without meaning to. It was warmth he had missed, strength he had missed, a sensation he had nearly forgotten, the feeling of being full. And in that moment, Erich understood for the first time that he had not been captured on the battlefield. He had surrendered in front of food. Hunger had driven him toward surrender, and food was driving him toward awakening. Life inside the camp quickly made Erich realize that the contrast was not a single moment of shock, but a constant, day-after-day sting. It was not created by one cracker or one tin of fruit, but by systems, by procedures, by a cold, almost frightening stability. By his second day in the camp, he understood that the Americans' treatment of prisoners was not a burst of impulse, nor the kindness of a particular soldier, but something standardized, institutionalized, and predictable. The world he had known was one of chaos, scarcity, and improvisation. The world facing him now was a vast machine that could maintain efficient consistency even in the matter of what prisoners were fed. The bugle in the morning was gentler than he had expected, not the piercing whistle he knew from the German front. The prisoners were formed into groups and marched in batches to the washing area. There, rows of taps and simple yet clean drainage channels had been set up, and each man could take his turn to wash his face and hands. When Erich scooped up the cold water in both hands, the simple freshness of it felt unfamiliar. Water at the front had almost always been laced with mud, oil, and the smell of cordite. Here, the water was so clear he could hardly believe it was real. After washing, they were led to the breakfast area, a row of field kitchens thrown up in haste but firmly built. Several American cooks in aprons moved deftly about, ladling steaming food from big pots. Steam rolled off the bottom of the pots, and the air was thick with the mingled aromas of meat, coffee, and toasted bread. It was not a luxurious smell, but it plainly belonged to normal life. The prisoners lined up, wrapped in a silence that defied description. They were full of expectation, and yet afraid to expect too much. When Erich's turn came, he watched a cook pour a generous scoop of oatmeal onto his mess tin, then lay a slice of bread toasted to a golden brown beside it, and finally add a small sausage. He gazed at that slice of bread for a long time, not because he was surprised it existed, but because he was surprised by its color. He had not seen that color for years. German black bread was never golden. It was gray, heavy, damp, more a substitute that might barely fill a stomach than real food. The cook poured him a cup of coffee and said casually, "Move along, buddy." That one word, buddy, struck Erich in a way he could not describe. The enemy had just called him partner. Even if it was only a habitual form of address, it was like a gentle knock on a door, pushing open a crack in a world that had already begun to totter. The prisoners sat around the field tables, mess tins clinking lightly against one another, a sound he had never heard at the front. There was no shouting, no chaos, no orders barked in fear, only the sounds of eating, of chewing, of occasional sighs. In Erich's ears, those sounds were more moving than any music. He took a bite of bread. The crust was crisp, the inside soft, carrying the scent of the fire on which it had been toasted. His jaw trembled slightly as he chewed. The taste was too real, too vivid, too unbelievable. Suddenly he remembered the last slice of black bread he had eaten at the front. Damp and heavy, its surface speckled with mold, which he had scraped away layer by layer with his knife. He had believed then that if he scraped enough and toasted it long enough, he could mask the rancid tang. Yet he still curled up that night with stomach pain. He had thought that was simply the nature of war, and that every army would be fighting under such conditions. Now he understood that normal food was never meant to be so far beyond his reach. A prisoner beside him let out a soft laugh, a sound hollow with exhaustion. He lifted his mess tin and gave it a small shake. "If I'd eaten like this at the front," he said, "I might have been able to run faster than a British tank." His remark drew a ripple of dry laughter. It was not joy, but a kind of powerless irony. They all knew what the joke truly meant. They had not lost in the fighting, they had lost at the table. Industrial might was written into every mouthful of food, more truthful than any battle report. Hatred can make a man raise a gun, but food can make him think clearly about the truth. After breakfast, they were taken to the registration area and the medical station. The staff carried out routine examinations, recording their weight, checking for fever, inspecting them for infected wounds. There was no shouting, no arbitrary violence, none of the numb indifference so common at the German front. The American medics worked quickly and precisely, as if treating their own soldiers. Their efficiency was disquieting and all the more shaming. One medic, while examining Erich's chest, paused for a moment. "You've lost too much weight. Must have been rough out there." He said it without sarcasm, without hatred, merely as a statement of fact. Erich nodded in silence. He did not know how to answer. He felt that his silence itself was an answer. Once registration was completed, the prisoners were led deeper into the camp, into what was in truth the living area. Rows of huts built from planks stood in order, with canvas stretched over their roofs. The bunks inside were simple but clean, each one with a blanket, and some prisoners had already started making their beds. The air carried none of the damp reek of boots and mold, none of the sour stink of spoiled food, none of the stifling heat or bitter cold of the front lines. This was a prisoner of war camp, and yet there was an uncanny sense of stability. Stability is the scarcest resource on a battlefield. In the afternoon, sunlight slanted in through the gaps between the planks, laying pale bands of light across the floor. Erich sat on the edge of his bunk, still holding the small piece of chocolate he had been given that morning. He had not eaten it, had not even dared to tear open the wrapper. He did not know why. He only felt that this piece of chocolate stood for something that had been suppressed for a long time and now was suddenly rising to the surface. He stared at the wrapper for a long time. It was chocolate made by the enemy, and yet it was more real than the promises his homeland had given him. For the first time, he truly understood that his beliefs had not simply dissolved. They had been broken by the force of comparison. Propaganda had not collapsed at the front line. It had died quietly in the face of clean packaging, warm coffee, golden bread, and that tin of fruit. Sitting on that unfamiliar yet spotless bunk, with the chocolate wrapper crackling softly under his fingers, he felt as if he were being reminded again and again. What he held was not just food, but contradiction itself. No storm of emotion rose within him. Only a slow, deep, utterly certain settling, beginning in his stomach, rising through his chest and finally reaching the innermost part of his thoughts. Instinctively, he thought back to the nights at the front. On those nights, he curled up in craters or under broken shelters, his stomach knotted so tightly he doubted he would live to see the dawn. He remembered one time when he was so hungry he could not sleep at all, and could only keep swallowing his own saliva to trick his body. Another time, after eating spoiled canned meat, he had vomited so violently that he was left dehydrated and barely able to stand, yet was still ordered to shoulder his communications gear and move toward the forward positions. He remembered the shame that could not be put into words, a grown soldier on his knees in the mud, retching until tears streamed down his face while his stomach remained empty. He remembered every one of those torments, and yet he had never questioned their cause. He had believed them to be the natural face of war, the work of the enemy, the decree of fate. It had never occurred to him that this hunger and pain were not bestowed by war, but were the sign of a state that could no longer sustain its army. Now, though, he held the enemy's chocolate in his hand, and the taste of oatmeal and bread still lingered in his mouth. Taste itself was a key, opening a door he had never dared to touch. Late at night, the camp gradually grew quiet. Outside the wire, the footsteps of patrols and the occasional bark of a dog drifted through the air. Inside the huts, there was only the sound of steady breathing. Erich lay on his narrow bunk, hands folded over his chest, staring up at the canvas overhead. The night wind blew into the hut with a cool edge, carrying the mingled scents of wood, soap, and the remnants of dinner. It did not smell like a battlefield. It smelled more like a place of temporary belonging. Suddenly, he realized that this might be the first time in months he had lain down to sleep in quiet, in warmth, and without hunger. Such a simple fact pressed on his chest like a stone, not with heaviness, but with a strangeness that left him almost unsure how to breathe. The emptiness that followed the departure of hunger was harder to bear than hunger itself. From the next bunk came a faint, stifled sobbing, a prisoner crying in secret. It was not fear, not humiliation, but a release that had been delayed too long. They all understood the same paradox. The prison camp had given them what the front could not. It was not freedom, but it was closer to life. The next morning, Erich was gently shaken awake. Assembly, roll call, breakfast, cleaning the camp. The routine verged on mechanical, and yet its regularity was oddly reassuring. The orderliness of the camp made him realize that there was another side to war. Administration, logistics, the daily functioning of a vast machine. And the German machine, in the final phase of the war, had already begun to grind and fail. At midday, he again received a small piece of bread and half a bowl of vegetable soup. In the soup floated slices of carrot, a chunk of potato, and a few strips of onion. It was as ordinary as food could be, and yet it held his gaze for a long time. The carrots drifted gently in the broth, bright in color. He thought of the soup he had drunk at the front, if it could be called soup at all. It was usually cloudy liquid boiled from canned meat, with a film of grease on top and sometimes even flecks of dirt. He had carried that taste in his memory for too long, so long that now, faced with real soup, he felt a sense of absurdity. After lunch, the prisoners were allowed to walk in the recreation area and hang their laundry to dry. A few of them sat in the sun by the wire, and two young German soldiers traded cigarettes, their motions as they lit up carrying a touch of boyish ease. Erich sat in the shade, quietly watching them. They seemed to have set down some great weight, not their weapons, but that earlier burden of having to believe in something. A middle-aged prisoner came over and sat beside him without any greeting, speaking softly. "When I had diarrhea at the front," he said, "I thought it was fate, you know." Now I realize it was just that our country had nothing left to feed us. Erich said nothing, but he understood. The man went on. Do you know where the sharpest contrast lies? It's not in how much they give us. It's in what we were given before. With that, he stood up, brushed the dust from his trousers, and walked away. He did not explain further because there was no need. In the sunlight, the camp presented one of the most unbelievable scenes of the war. A group of soldiers who had been driven almost to collapse by hunger were recovering their strength in the enemy's camp. No gunfire, no tragic heroics, no valor. Only life. And life itself was the strongest contrast of all. In the afternoon, the usual mail registration took place. Any prisoner could fill out a card to be forwarded home by the Red Cross. Erich received a card, white and dry, printed with clear English and German. He held the pencil for a long time without writing a word. It was not that he did not know what to say. It was that he did not know whether he should tell the truth. If he wrote, "I am eating well," would his mother believe him? If he wrote, "The Americans are treating us kindly," would his neighbors believe him? If he wrote, "They give us butter, crackers and soup," who would believe it? If someone else read the letter, would it be taken as mockery, as rumor, even as treason? In the end, he wrote only 2 lines. "I am safe. Please do not worry. I will come back alive." As he set down the pencil, he let out a quiet sigh. The sentences he had not written weighed heavier than those he had. In the evening, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing that the prisoners would receive an extra snack later that night. Sometimes biscuits, sometimes soup, sometimes fruit. Tonight it would be apples, 1 per man, green, with the sheen of wax upon their skins. When Erich received his apple and looked at the smooth peel, he felt a surge of absurdity. The last time he had seen a whole piece of fruit had been at home, before the war. This apple did not stand for its flavor. It stood for a fact that was almost cruel. The enemy had the ability to let you eat like a human being, while your own country had made you eat like a beast. He did not eat it at once. Instead, he laid the apple on his knees and ran his palm gently over its round surface. He could feel the warmth of the fruit under his fingertips, the warmth of life, and the warmth of reality. He realized a profound, harsh, yet honest truth. What truly breaks a soldier is not the enemy's gun, but that bite of food taken from the enemy's hand. Food does not lie, and lies cannot fill an empty stomach. The next morning he wrote in his diary, "I have discovered something absurd. Freedom can let a man starve to death, while captivity can let him live. I do not know whether this is the cruelty of war or the truth of the world. If war is a mirror, then food is the beam of light that makes the reflection visible." As he wrote those lines, his heart was calm. There was no anger, no sorrow, only clarity. The outcome of war is not decided by faith. It is decided by who can keep their soldiers fed. Day after day, life in the camp flowed with the steadiness of a slow river. Food was supplied on schedule, medical checks carried out on schedule, work details arranged on schedule. With hunger receding, their eyes began to regain their brightness and their cheeks slowly filled out. One day, looking into a mirror, Erich saw a face that was no longer gaunt. He felt the irony, but he also felt a certain solid reassurance. In the enemy's hands, he had for the first time regained a measure of human dignity. One afternoon, he sat by the wire, letting the sun fall across his body. Suddenly he remembered that moment on the day he was captured when he tore open the ration pack. It had not been humiliation nor shame, but a symbol of one nation surrendering to another. Not with a signature, but with its stomach. Softly he spoke to himself as though stating a conclusion or leaving a testament. We did not lose on the battlefield. We lost in our bread. We lost in our butter. We lost in that spoonful of peaches. His whisper drifted away on the wind, heavier than any shout.